Inflation slows, the Home Secretary escapes investigation, and Prime Minister's Questions is at noon. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister Dame Andrea Leadsom, Labour MP Dame Angela Eagle, the Scottish National Party MP John Nicholson and the Editor-in-Chief of Unheard, Freddie Sayers. On the programme today...
Whilst it is welcome that the headline rate of inflation has fallen, these numbers show there is absolutely no room for complacency in the battle against inflation.
Inflation falls to 8.7%. Will Rishi Sunak meet his target of halving it by the end of the year? The Prime Minister says Home Secretary Suella Braverman did not break the ministerial code and will not be investigated over her handling of a speeding offence.
Today's news shows that there are some people who will never rest until they have hounded Boris further and further.
Boris Johnson is referred to police over new claims he broke COVID lockdown rules. After that audacious incursion into Russian territory, can Ukraine win the war outright? And Keir Starmer takes on Rishi Sunak at Prime Minister's Questions. We'll bring you that live at noon. Let's start with the latest inflation figures. Show you the headline in the BBC News. UK inflation down to 8.7%, but food bills still rising quickly. It had been predicted, we talked about it yesterday, in fact, on the programme, that rate would fall to single-digit figures. It is actually a little bit higher than the 8.2 figure that was widely forecast. But food prices are still continuing to rise and are at a record high. So my opening question for the panel, starting with you, Andrea, is: will Rishi Sunak hit his target, his pledge of halving inflation by the end of the year?
I hope so. I really hope so, for the sake of all of those people who are really struggling with food bills right now. Angela and I are both on the Treasury Select Committee, and we had the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee and the Governor in front of us yesterday. His view is that inflation will come down, but the Bank of England now expect it to come down slower than previously. But to be clear, this is a global problem. So food price inflation in the UK is still just over 19%. In the EU, it's over 20%, and in the US, it's over 20%. So this global issue, largely sparked by energy prices, the war in Ukraine, etc., is a very sticky issue, and there's no doubt it's going to take some time before the rise in prices eases altogether. Do you think Rishi Sunak will hit his target of halving inflation? It was halving the double-digit figure earlier in the year, so I think we're talking about 5.25%, or 5.5%. Do you think he'll get there?
Well, firstly, I think he had adopted that target because he thought it would be easy, and it's actually proving to be stickier coming down inflation than I think he expected. And I think we also have to remember that inflation coming down still means prices are rising. They're just rising at a slower level. So it might be a slight relief for a lot of people who are under the cosh in the cost of living crisis, but it's still huge pressure. And if you look at the figures, core inflation has actually gone up to 6.8% from 6.2%, and that is the figure that the Bank of England look at. So this implies higher interest rates for longer.
Well, that could do, couldn't it, when we hear from the Bank of England
again? To
bring
inflation down, and that implies increased costs of mortgages and that cost of living squeeze going on.
Well, you're certainly right in terms of the squeeze on people's cost of living. What would Labour do? Would there be another option to try and bring down that core inflation? As you say, it is sticky. They are underlying factors as well as food inflation. Would there be a path that Labour would pursue?
Well, I think we've said that we would want to stabilise the economy, but also have a much more obvious industrial strategy, an increased windfall on the oil and gas companies' windfall tax, so that we could actually pay for more support for people, particularly who are suffering at the lower end with the cost of living crisis. So there'd be a difference opinion
but in terms
and
of actually,
approach.
but in terms of actually bringing it down, it may prove to be as difficult.
Just on this windfall tax, because all Labour commentators say we'd have this big windfall tax. There is already 75% corporation tax. What Labour are talking about is making it 78%. But that 3% differential they've spent at least 10 times. So actually that 3% difference between what they are already paying, 75%, so a 40% tax rate
it would
plus
be a higher
30%, 35% windfall rate. It's hard to see how that would make any difference.
I think there's an issue as well about profiteering when prices are rising, and we'd be much tougher to check that
on supermarkets,
there
for example?
wasn't profiteering going on, particularly on food prices, which are 19%, a 45-year high. Very, very difficult for consumers to realise whether within those price rises is an element of profiteering. And I want the competition authorities in this country to be much tougher.
I think they're looking at it.
They've said they're looking at it, because with inflation so high and food and essential inflation so high, it's particularly unfair if there's profiteering going on.
I'll come back to you in just a moment, but let's bring in our other guests. John, I've almost forgotten what the question was. Oh, yes, Rishi Sunak, will he hit his target of halving inflation by the end of the year?
Well, I think we're all agreed that we would like...
Of course.
We would like him to. And it's one of these things where you're so closely in touch with this as a constituency MP, because we have people coming in. I do surgeries every week, as I'm sure we all do, and I hear time and time again from people who are struggling so much, especially with food prices. I had a group of kids visited me this week at Westminster who are doing lunch clubs in Scotland. And it's a wonderful thing, but it's heartrending at the same time. The food poverty is one of the greatest issues that we're facing. And it's one of those things the Scottish Government has tried to tackle with the Scottish Child Payment, which, of course, we have, that they don't have south of the border. And we've expanded free school meals and are continuing to expand that, which I think is very important.
It is, again, though, about whether you can actually bring inflation down successfully. It has gone down a bit. But do you think now it's looking less or more likely that the Prime Minister will reach that target? Very firm pledge by him.
I think it's touch and go whether it hits 5.5, but the whole language of target is itself a bit misleading, because there's relatively little that national governments do. And I'm afraid Andrew is right that this is a global story. It's to do with energy prices, it's to do with sanctions, it's to do with central bank responses, and inflation. If you do an analysis against European countries, some are worse, some are better. America is coming down. What I think is important is to think what's going to be the situation in 12 months when the general election is coming up. And I'm afraid, no thanks probably to Rishi Sunak, although he will take the credit, the situation is going to look a lot better. It will feel like life is much more back to normal just around the time that the Tories want it to. So I'm afraid more by luck than by work, they're going to get the credit for it.
You can help mitigate, of course, the effect that it has on families, because that's the most important thing. Families who are struggling, how do you help them? That's where you have to help with food prices, for example. All
right, we're going to talk about the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, because in the last hour or so, it's been confirmed that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has decided not to order an investigation into his Home Secretary after she was revealed and reported to have asked civil servants whether she could avoid paying a speeding fine by taking a personal speed awareness course instead. There's been an exchange of letters, one from Suella Braverman to the Prime Minister, explaining her reasons, and Rishi Sunak has responded, saying he has asked his independent advisor to look at it, and Sir Laurie Magnus has decided on this occasion further investigation is not necessary, and the Prime Minister says, well, I have accepted that advice, and he said he didn't believe the matter amounted to a breach of the ministerial code. Suella Braverman had beforehand written a very long, detailed letter in which she explained in full her reasons for the course of action that she decided to take. But you can see there highlighted that in the end, she said she would have chosen a different course of action with hindsight. Let's talk to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, hello to you. I mean, on the face of it, I suppose you could say straightforward decision by the Prime Minister based on advice from his ethics advisor. But on closer inspection, was it a finely balanced judgment to do with the internal state of the Conservative Party?
Nothing says Westminster, Jo, like an exchange of letters, particularly an exchange of letters on Wednesday morning immediately prior to Prime Minister's questions, where the Prime Minister would have needed an answer on what he was doing as far as Suella Braverman was concerned, and he now has that answer. That doesn't mean it won't be scrutinised, of course, by the opposition parties, but he has come to a decision. He'll hope that the arc of this story, if you like, has turned a full circle. So, from the Prime Minister's perspective, his argument is, look, that he is a scrupulous follower of due process, so hence his involvement of Sir Lawrie Magnus, the independent advisor on ministers' interests, and Sir Laurie's judgment, as articulated in the letter from the Prime Minister, that there wasn't enough to see here to warrant a full investigation by the independent advisor. So the Prime Minister can say in that sense he has followed the process to its logical conclusion, and the Home Secretary, as you were articulating, can say in her letter, maybe I should have chosen a different course of action, just swallowed the points of the fine and not caused all of this brouhaha. The crux of what she's saying in her letter out loud, we've had this from her team over the last couple of days, but to see it explicitly written down in her own words, is that she didn't fancy the potential embarrassment of doing an online speed awareness course where one of her fellow speedsters decided to leak to a reporter that the Home Secretary was on the course. I'm not sure, to be quite honest, even if that had happened, it would have generated all that much news, to be honest, but she was clearly nervous about that, hence the request that she made of civil servants and special advisors to see if there was an alternative route through it. To answer your question directly, Jo, sorry I'm being rather long-winded here, there are some, on the Conservative backbenches, particularly on the right of the party, who see Suella Braverman as something of a flag wave, if you like, for their outlook of conservatism within the government, and see it as very important that she remains there, and an irritation from some at what they see as some within the machinery of government out to get her, bluntly, and so will be relieved that that has not been the outcome of what's happened here.
Well, Chris, let's also talk about a former Prime Minister, also on the front pages of some of the newspapers. I'm just going to show our viewers and guests. The Guardian, Boris Johnson referred to police over new claims of COVID rule breach. And I think we have the front cover of the Daily Mail. Boris threatens to sue Cabinet Office for COVID stitch-up. What's going on here?
So this was first broken by the Times last night. Yes, Boris Johnson, COVID rules and the police making news yet again. What we've got here is Boris Johnson currently has two teams of lawyers paid for by us, the taxpayer. One team is looking into his and helping him with his submission to the COVID public inquiry. The other has been working with him as far as the Privileges Committee is concerned. You remember that is looking into whether he recklessly or intentionally misled the Commons over COVID. Now, the lawyers who were looking into his COVID inquiry submission came across details in his prime ministerial diary which they felt were worthy of further investigation. They passed them on to the client, their client as a legal team. That client is the government, because the taxpayer is picking up the legal bill. When the Cabinet Office looked at these entries, they decided they should be passed on to the police, to the Metropolitan Police and Thames Valley Police, because the suggestion is this relates to events in Downing Street and also in Chequers, in Buckinghamshire, or the Prime Minister's country retreat. Mr Johnson's team say that they got the other set of lawyers, the ones from the Privileges Committee, to look into this, and they reckon there was nothing to see here. But what's really striking, classic Boris Johnson, his response to this is in capital letters and is in primary colours, and he says that he thinks that this has the whiff of being a political stitch-up. They think the timing is fishy, and this suggestion that they might pursue legal action against the Cabinet Office, I don't think we should massively overstate the likelihood of that. They seem particularly aggrieved that the Cabinet Office might have written down that he had acted unlawfully. I'm told by the Cabinet Office, they say they just merely passed on the kind of data set that said, look, these things happened in Downing Street and in Chequers, over to you, police officers, to decide whether or not you want to look into it.
Chris Mason, thank you very much. Let's start with Suella Braverman. Was that the right decision, Andrew, by the Prime Minister, not to call an investigation or not to go ahead?
The Prime Minister wasn't making a decision. What he was doing was acceding to the independent ethics advisor that he was under massive pressure to set up. and abide by the decisions of. And indeed, in the case of Dominic Raab, only recently, he did abide by that as well. I mean, it certainly seems to me, if you can't insist that he has an independent investigator and that he abides by the decisions of the independent investigator, and then criticise him for not doing that, and you can't have it both ways. He's got this independent person. They've said the ministerial code wasn't broken. He's accepted that.
Right. Well,
there's nothing to see about that.
Nothing to see here, Angela.
No, don't misquote me there, Jo.
No.
I'm saying
that is what you said.
Because that is a different headline. Nothing to see here. I'm not saying that Suella Braverman has no cause to answer, but to your point about what the Prime Minister has decided to do, all he has decided to do is to do as the independent.
Do you think she has got a case to answer?
I on that point, I myself, and I'm not happy about it. I attended a speed awareness course some years ago now, and actually during that speed awareness course, really struggled to concentrate because I spent my time thinking, is anyone looking at me? And thinking that's at the time I was a junior minister, and actually I think some of the points that have been made about the need for everybody in a speed awareness course to focus on what is actually a really important bit of learning for drivers is actually a very valid one. So, I don't think she has a case to answer because the independent ethics advisor says the ministerial code wasn't broken.
Well, to slightly conflate then, there's nothing to see here, Angela.
Well, she'd already been sacked once for breaking the ministerial code. She was brought back after 6 days in what I think was obviously a deal to avoid there being a vote to put the Prime Minister in Downing Street. He's too weak to get rid of her. I mean, I would rather see her sacked for being completely incompetent and useless at her job. But there is here a kind of pattern of ministers thinking that the laws don't apply to them. The laws they set, the laws that they're responsible for, somehow they ought to
Well, obviously
get out
that's not
of.
the case because the independent ethics advisor says...
Yeah, well, I'm coming to that. Let Angela finish her point.
This is the third independent ethics advisor. The two previous ones had to resign because the then Prime Minister...
But do you not accept what Laurie Magnus has said? There isn't enough to investigate here.
As I say, I think that the idea that you can have special treatment is not one of the principles that I'd like to see government ministers availing themselves of. So far we've had Gavin Williams and Dominic Raab and Naheem Zahawi have to resign from this cabinet because of the way that... Well, finally, I mean, they had to be dragged kicking and screaming.
Well, I mean, but what's at the heart of this issue? I mean, is it about Rishi Sunak not having the strength to make his own decisions about what he feels about Suella Braverman, or is it in the way that Angela said, should he be judging her more on her job as Home Secretary, rather than the way she's handled this speeding offence?
It's just fundamentally not serious. I really think a lot of people will be watching this thinking, well, there's a war in Europe, we have massive economic problems, we have a rising China, we don't know where we're going as the whole West, and here we are talking about speeding tickets and these tiny process stories. It's like we're addicted to the most trivial aspects, both as political, but also, I've got to say, as a media culture. Why can't we focus on the important things? If you don't like what Suella Braverman is saying, then get her on the big principles. You might have principled objections to her view on migration. Fine, talk about that. But little details about speeding tickets, most people, I think, will throw their hands up in the air and say, who cares?
Well, do you agree with Freddie? Are you throwing your hands up in the air?
That sounds far too a camp a gesture. I think we all just about fell off our chairs with astonishment, didn't we, when we discovered that this wasn't going to go anywhere further. To address the point about whether or not ministers should behave differently from the rest of us, I think ministers should live in the real world. I think if she gets caught speeding, and incidentally, it's important to remember that her officials initially denied that she'd been speeding. Her political officials denied that she'd been speeding, so they didn't tell the truth initially. Of course, she should go off with a hoi polloi and sit in a room with all the other people who committed exactly the same offence, and she should be trained. That's how ministers get detached from reality.
She did pay the fine, and she took the point.
Yeah, but she wriggled, didn't she? If she'd initially just thrown up her hands and said, I've done this, I'm not the only person in the country to speed, I'm very sorry I've done it, the story would have gone away. It would have gone away. It's all the wriggling.
What is that a technical term? She wriggled. So have you never had a decision where if as I say, I've done a speed awareness course. You get an offer, you take 3 points and a fine, or you do a speed awareness course. I was actually quite interested to do the speed awareness course, and I was conscious that that actually could end up in some embarrassment. If you're the Home Secretary, you can understand her wriggling, as you put it, simply taking the decision, is it possible to do this without being in a spotlight?
I can understand why she's embarrassed. If I were her, I would be embarrassed a lot of the time. But she should have sat there with everybody else and done the course.
And you want her sacked for it. I agree with Freddie. It's just...
I mean, I'd rather see her sacked for being useless at her job.
And I agree with that. She should be sacked for other stuff.
She's useless at her job.
You sort of agree that this is not a big enough issue, really, to be spending time.
Things pile up. I mean, I think if we look at Boris Johnson, he's not content with breaking his own lockdown rules in Downing Street. He seems to have done it.
Well, hang on.
He's
saying he absolutely hasn't, and he's threatening to take legal action.
His supporters are now threatening to up the ante by threatening to disrupt the government until Rishi Sunak, who's the Prime Minister, presumably tells the police that they can't investigate what the Cabinet Office have said.
The BBC was reporting this morning on the Today programme, an Evening Standard report of some poor old man who'd also broken the lockdown rules. He'd gone to his allotment because being at home was doing his heat in. Yeah. He'd gone to the allotment. He's now been hit by a massive fine for this. Once again, in other words, different rules for the little people from ministers.
In other words, the rules in themselves is what we should be talking about. And it's uncomfortable for the three MPs here because as the three largest parties, no one disagreed with them. But the evidence is increasingly mounting that a lot of those lockdown rules were not necessary. We have the comparison with Sweden, which is my own country, which now has the best excess death result in the whole of Europe, and they never had a lockdown. No one wants to ask that question because it's very embarrassing that there was no opposition during that period. That's what we should be going after Boris Johnson on, not breaking the rules, which is poetic justice.
A time of great uncertainty with a novel virus, nobody knew what would happen, to know with hindsight what was the best thing to do. But to try to protect life was obviously the best thing to do. And to have the Prime Minister actually say in the end, albeit a bit late, that we ought to have a lockdown and then completely ignore the rules himself
and
over
interpret
and
the
over
law.
and over again.
Interpret the
that
law
is
with
the scandal.
Interpret the law with compassion. That's the other important thing. I mean, the police, when it came to this old man, for example, and lots of other examples, should have been showing compassion, as should the courts.
All right, well, let's have a look at the Boris Johnson. You raised the issue, Angela, of the response. Stephen Swinford, we can show you the tweet, actually, from the Times' political editor. Boris Johnson allies up the ante and warned they will obstruct Rishi Sunak's government unless he intervened to stop what they see as a witch hunt. They say it's the final straw for Johnson and warn that MPs and members supportive of the former Prime Minister will begin organising. But this was the response from the Justice Secretary on the BBC earlier today.
Well, I think we just have to look calmly at what the situation is. So for the COVID inquiry, documentation has to be considered by lawyers so that material can be provided to the inquiry so that they can complete their full work. Now, that was considered by lawyers. Lawyers saw material that they had a concern about. They provided it to the civil service entirely properly. Civil service then considered it. And then without any ministerial involvement, there's no, I want to be clear about that. It's not a criticism of anyone, but without any ministerial involvement, it was then passed to the police. But look, they the civil servants would have had to consider the civil service code. If they'd sat on it, people would have criticised them for that. If they pass it on, others will criticise. So look, they were put in quite a difficult position. And ultimately, it comes down to what's in the documents, which I haven't seen, and I dare say you haven't seen either.
Well, Justice Secretary Alex Chalk, I mean, Andrea, it was very explicit to emphasising about no ministerial involvement in this decision to refer to the police. Well, I mean, why would Tory ministers want to do any harm to a former Conservative Prime Minister?
Nobody would. I think he was merely clarifying that there wasn't ministerial involvement. He wasn't emphasising and clarifying.
Too much,
no, I don't think he does. I think it's reading too much into it. The point I want to make is that genuinely, all of us have constituents, people who couldn't see loved ones, who couldn't attend funerals, etc. So it is a very important point if those who made the rules broke the rules. That is a very important point.
And so it was right to refer this, right for the Cabinet Office to refer this.
I'm not commenting on that because I don't know any of the details about it, but I definitely do accept that the civil service will have done their job, and I certainly I'm not looking for some sort of, someone's stitching someone up here. I think the point is that what has to be done is due process in this. It has to be properly looked at, and I certainly have just so many constituents who were devastated by lockdowns and to this day are still suffering. So I don't think it's non-trivial, but I also don't think it's political. I think it's an issue of due process and it needs to be allowed to work its way through.
Right. Well, Jacob Rees-Mogg then, because he's threatening to bring the government to
Well, he said it is a stitch-up. And, of course, the sort of logical conclusion when the Privileges Committee have also reported back into the claims that Boris Johnson misled Parliament, deliberately misled Parliament, is, of course, a recall petition. Yeah. And there could then be a by-election. You accept that could be the one conclusion?
Well, I accept that that's a process that the Privileges Committee have at their disposal, but I'm not prejudging any of the conclusions. Obviously, as I've just said, the important thing is due process that's fair to all sides.
All right, let's talk about Ukraine. One of the issues, Freddie's saying that he thinks many people are far more concerned about than perhaps the Home Secretary's speeding fine or how she handled it. Anyway, in the Dallas Morning News, in Dallas, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson calls for Ukraine support. Yes, Boris Johnson has been in Texas lobbying Republicans, telling them they are backing the right horse and that Vladimir Putin, will be defeated. Is it right, Freddie, for the UK to pursue a victory at all costs, or will there be some sort of negotiated settlement?
I think it looks increasingly clear that there will have to be a negotiated settlement. And in fact, the French, the Germans and sometimes even the Americans are sounding a lot more realistic on that. The UK, for some reason, has allied itself with Eastern European countries that use this phrase, victory at all costs, which means expelling all Russian troops, including Crimea. And most people will privately admit that's not realistic and might actually be dangerous. You mentioned what you called an audacious incursion into Russian territory, which we found about yesterday. This is using American hardware, American vehicles, with anti-Russian neo-Nazi militias were responsible for that raid in Belgorod. It's a complex, very difficult to understand situation, and I wish we had a bit more temperate language and less Boris Johnson-style gung-ho victory at all costs.
Well, you raised the incident. The Washington Post covers it like this. The US distances itself from Belgorod incident after Humvee seen on Russian side. What do you make of what Freddie says, Andrea, in terms of where the UK is positioning itself? Not perhaps with the realpolitik of the French and Germans, much more with the Eastern European countries.
So I think the Prime Minister has been quite clear that this is a decision for the Ukrainians as to the ultimate goal of this repelling of Putin's aggression, and that the UK will continue to stand by Ukraine to achieve its goals
of all-out victory.
Of liberating Ukraine from Russian aggression. So I do not believe that the UK...
That includes sending F-16s, for example. So yesterday we find out that American hardware is being used against what they explicitly promised inside Russian territory. And then we're continuing with the idea that we're going to furnish them with F-16s and long-range missiles and all these ammunitions. There must be some reasonable questions about whether we are going to remain in control of this situation. It's irresponsible just to talk about victory at all costs like Boris Johnson is. Let's not take our cues from Boris Johnson on geopolitics.
But what about the F-16s? Because Rishi Sunak and also the Dutch Premier are wanting to rally. No, but they want because we don't have any. But
we do.
Want to rally.
We do. No, to be specific, we're not providing fighter jets because they're not compatible with Ukraine training or usage.
But they're rallying international support to provide them, and now Joe Biden
military, humanitarian.
Is that right?
And financial support for Ukraine to be able to repel Russia. And in terms of what actually the goal of Ukraine is, the UK is standing by Ukraine and saying that it is ultimately, whether it's a negotiated settlement or, as you say, all-out victory, that is a matter for Ukraine to decide, but the UK is backing Ukraine. And of course, let's be clear, this is in our interest to do so. You know, we've been talking about inflation, food prices, energy prices. That was sparked by Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It is very much in the UK's interest to see
But we're talking specifically
repelled.
about what that victory looks like. I mean, is it going to be a more negotiated settlement in the way that certainly the French president seems to think, or is it going to be a victory that actually includes taking back Crimea, for example?
Well, we don't know because we can't look in a crystal ball. But what we have to do is support a country that was free, that's been invaded by an outside aggressor, that have destroyed vast numbers of its cities, killed tens of thousands of its people and caused millions of them to flee across borders. You cannot allow the behaviour of Putin and his henchmen in Russia to be rewarded with people accepting that somehow the reality they create on the ground has got to be accepted. That mistake was made in Crimea.
You can still be
and
careful with
therefore,
your language, though. You can acknowledge the original sin. You can acknowledge the aggression.
Well, you didn't acknowledge the original sin.
And the fact that it was a Russian invasion, and you can condemn that without saying that victory at all costs, any weapons are appropriate.
Well, nobody's saying that. Nobody's saying that. Yeah. The thing is that we've got to support the people that are fighting for their existence against mass murder from an outside aggressor. If we don't do that, then the next period in European history is going to be just one of mass conflict and the rights of the most powerful to do whatever they want against any kind of humane standard or international law. And if you want to live in a world like that,
I want to live
fantastic.
in a peaceful world, and
but I want to live in a peaceful world.
But are you letting Putin off the hook?
No, I think you've got to have peace as the main objective, right? You've got, and that ultimately.
Yes, but you can't have peace.
But that means.
One of you shouted at him at once.
Talking about reckless ideas like expelling everyone from Crimea, which is what.
Nobody's talking
about
that.
Well, it is. That's what's been talked about because it's not realistic, and you then plant in the Ukrainians' mind the idea that the West will back them all the way up to that point, which in reality they won't. And we are creating a potentially much more dangerous situation. Whilst I think a more temperate language would really help.
Quite hard to have
let's have a look. Let's have a look at the headline here, and you can respond to it. Russia warns of colossal risks if the fighter jets, the F-16s, are sent to Ukraine. I mean, does it worry you?
Well, of course, the whole thing worries me. But I think we clearly reacted unwisely after the invasion of Crimea. We weren't really tough enough. We embraced Putin far too quickly. There have to be consequences when you invade a sovereign country for world order. Now, Putin was allowed to get away with too much, too often, and without threat of consequences. Yeah. We have got to defend the Ukrainians. As the other panellists have said, Putin has been committing mass murder. He should end up in the War Crimes Tribunal. And can we also spare a thought, too, for all the young Russian conscripts who are being dragged away from their families and homes? They're being sent off to be slaughtered in Ukraine for an unwinnable war. And of course, there's got to be a negotiation at the end, and that's got to be. It has to be up to the Ukrainians to decide what and how they want to settle. But Putin has shown absolutely no interest whatsoever in any form of negotiated settlement.
And that's true, isn't it, Freddie?
I mean, there were talk of negotiation early on in the conflict, and the West was also not interested. Well, the West wasn't interested in that either.
The Ukrainians talked about talks.
Certainly,
the Russians didn't.
Look, certainly, I think Vladimir Putin is playing a waiting game here. Maybe he's calculating that Donald Trump will be victorious in 2024, and that might help him. So,
he's probably actively helping Donald Trump to be victorious in 2024, like he did the last time Donald Trump won.
That has been partially thrown out, and I think that's a conversation for another day.
I don't think it has, really.
Well, we can't talk...
Donald Trump is an apologist for Putin terrorism.
Yes.
Always has been.
All right, but going back to the point about whether there could ever be a negotiated settlement, I mean, is it really viable with someone like Vladimir Putin?
There will have to be in the end, and the risk is, as you said, there are young Russian kids losing their lives, there are young Ukrainians losing their lives by the tens of thousands, and the sooner that peace can be arrived at, the better. So if there is a sense, but we need to have a process.
No, but you're talking as though somehow for those of us who say you have to meet fire with fire, that somehow we're not interested in peace. Ukraine wants peace. What Ukraine wants is its sovereign territory back.
Exactly.
That's what the rest of the world is helping them to achieve for exactly the reasons, because Putin is murdering innocent civilians.
In your view, does that include Crimea?
140,000 Ukrainians coming to the UK to live here, fleeing Putin's aggression. It cannot be allowed to stand. And actually, I think the bigger worry, you talk about a negotiated settlement, Russia's economy is, they are now an absolutely isolated, a completely destroyed state. Their economy is in ruins. Their young men have either left or they've been sent to be slaughtered. There won't be much left of Russia to negotiate with. And, of course, you've then got the rise of China and China's relationship with Russia. There's an awful lot at stake here. And simply to say, well, let's have peace and let's
and the Crimeans are calling out as well to be liberated. There is a hierarchy of abuse in Crimea with the indigenous people, the Tartars, at the bottom, and then the Ukrainians after that, and the Russians, and the economy of Crimea is in chaos.
Well, on that note of Crimea,
back to Ukraine.
We're going to talk about a different story. Let's have a look at this in The Guardian. The chair of UK's equality watchdog being investigated after staff complaints. Yes, these are allegations against Baroness Faulkner. She says in the Daily Telegraph, determined to fight attempted coup by young Liberal civil servants. And then finally, in the Mail, they're covering the story differently. End the hounding of this brave woman. Groundswell of support grows for equality boss Baroness Faulkner, who won't back down in women's rights outcry amid witch hunt by trans activists. Let's talk to the BBC's LGBT and identity correspondent, Lauren Moss. She's in our Salford newsroom. Hello to you, Lauren. What is this story? What do you make of the story, first of all?
Well, I'll give you the background to it and what sort of led up the background to this investigation by Channel 4, where some of these allegations have emerged. Back in February, the Minister for Women and Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, wrote to the Equality and Human Rights Commission asking for advice about amending the Equality Act to clarify the definition of sex. Now, in April, the chair of the EHRC, Baroness Faulkner, replied, saying that if sex was defined as biological sex in the Act, it would bring clarity in some areas and merited further consideration. Now, what it would do if that happened in effect would make it simpler for single-sex spaces and services to exclude transgender people, even if they have a gender recognition certificate that's changed their legal sex. And there are around 7,000 people in England, Wales and Scotland who have one of these. Now, whilst this was welcomed by some women's campaign groups, around 30 LGBT charities led by Stonewall wrote to the UN and said that the EHRC is on a course that would lead to the rolling back of trans rights and would risk considerable harm. And they also called for the EHRC status as an independent group to be revoked last year after the EHRC wrote to ask Scotland to pause its gender recognition reform bill plans. And so last night, Channel 4 broadcast these allegations, including that 2 in 5 LGBT staff have left the EHRC in the last year, and concerns from staff that the Commission's impartiality and independence from government is under threat, it said, with the board assisting the government in undermining trans rights by proposing amendments to the Equality Act. Now, the EHRC itself hasn't detailed the nature of the investigation that's going on into itself, but it does say it takes allegations of bullying and harassment very seriously. And with regards to legal advice, it can be very complex, some of the things they advise upon, and that no advice is disregarded. Well, Baroness Faulkner herself says she's worked her whole life around the principle of equalities and human rights, and she will be rebutting some of these allegations and has every confidence of being exonerated.
Lauren Moss, thank you very much. Freddie, you've been writing about this, maybe not you personally, but certainly unheard. Baroness Faulkner is right to stand up to gender ideology. The peer has endued abuse for saying that sex is biological.
So her original crime was to want to add the word biological before the word sex, which to most people wouldn't even need doing. It's common sense. This is not about persecuting trans people or anything like that. What most people in this country believe, and the polling is very clear on this, is that trans people should be respected, they should live with dignity, and they should not be persecuted in any way. But the rights of women need to be held in the balance, which includes all women's spaces, it includes women in sport, and that is a sensitive balance which I believe Baroness Faulkner was trying to strike. And what's happened here is very much the playbook that we see, which is that junior members of an organisation who disagree with the politics of the senior people put about these claims of harassment or bullying or feeling violated in some way, and that's how they go after them. And it's the same idea. Why don't we go after people on the principle instead of these so-called behavioural issues?
Angela? Is that what's happening? Is she being hounded?
I have no idea exactly what's happening in there, because we know that there's an internal investigation, and we know that it's about allegations of harassment and bullying. We know for a fact that 25% of the staff have left that organisation in the last year, and that 40% of the LGBT plus staff have left that organisation. So just from those facts alone, there's clearly something very troubling going on. I then look at the Daily Mail, and its headline is that it describes Baroness Falconer, who I don't know and have never met, as the woman breaking woke. That is what they said about her. If she's been put into that job to break woke, then she's not in the right job. The EHRC is there to defend the rights of all people who have special protected characteristics under equality law, including women. Oh, by the way, I'm a woman. I'm a woman, and I'm a gay person. So don't start lecturing me about that.
No, but
okay?
Angela, can I just hang on? Let me just read you from the.
I don't know what's going on in the EHRC.
No, but let me tell you what has happened.
But we will find out in due course.
The Minister for Women and Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, wrote to the EHRC asking for advice about amending the Equality Act's definition of sex. Baroness Faulkner responded and said redefining sex as biological sex merited further consideration in an area that she described as polarised and contentious. Any change could make it easier to exclude transgender people from single-sex spaces.
Of course.
Is that a problem?
But the Equality Act allows each, as it's currently written, allows each circumstance, be it in sport, be it in single-sex spaces, to be dealt with on its merits. It's a perfectly good piece of legislation that doesn't need that kind of changing. It's worked very well for all of the years that it's been in place since 2010. It's also worked in line with the Gender Recognition Act, which has been in place since 2004. It's only that people are trying to cause trouble and dissension between trans people's rights and women's rights that we've got this problem, and unheard is part of the problem.
So culture wars imported from the States. As Angela says, if 40% of your LGBT staff have left, you've clearly got a problem. We know why she was put in place. She was put in place by Liz Truss. This is imported culture wars from the United States. The intention is to roll back equality. It has a knock-on effect beyond trans people. We've seen increasing attacks against gay people and against lesbians as well. And do you know what the presumption of the Daily Mail, which hardly has a track record of defending women's rights, trying to say that people like Angela don't speak up for women. How dare these transphobes? How dare they presume to talk for women?
But let's also say that there are lots of gay people, of both men and women, who are really, really worried about some of these ideas and ideology around the trans issue.
Small minority.
Because it threatens their identity as well. And some, for example, there's a new thing called the Lesbian Project, which is celebrating lesbians and saying that they are anxious that, if the atmosphere was the same when they were young, they would, in some cases, have been encouraged to be trans in some way. So it's actually it's a threat to those identities as well. So let's not simplify it as a kind of...
I don't feel threatened if trans people get to live their lives with respect and dignity. And if there was actually attempts to talk about the facts about this rather than hundreds of really biased, really hate-filled coverage of the threat, apparently, that trans people pose to everybody but themselves, we wouldn't have developed this kind of atmosphere around these debates. I think that everyone has a right to live with respect and dignity, whatever their identity. We have to respect something that we might not understand with trans people. Many people have never met a trans person. They don't understand. We have to create a circumstance where we can have proper debate and confidence building, not these kinds of tabloid headlines which just set up one group of people against another in order to create a conflict so we can have a culture war and break woke.
Is that what's going on, that it is a culture war? Baroness Faulkner says, I have worked my whole life to promote the principles of equality and human rights. She's taking these allegations very seriously, and with humility, I'll be cooperating fully with the investigation by presenting a detailed rebuttal and have every confidence in being exonerated. Is this about culture wars? Is this the government playing into divisive politics in the way that Angela and John have expressed?
I actually think there's not that much that we really argue about. I think as politicians, you know, I've got some lovely trans constituents, had some great conversations with them. You know, I'd say Angela and I get on quite well, don't we, considering we're, you know, we're opposite ends of the political spectrum. And you know, for me, and actually for my grown-up kids, none of us would see, well, are you trans? Are you a lesbian? You know, we don't think of people like that. I actually think this is more of a criticism of the public discourse. I think the public discourse around this has gone completely wrong. And I don't think John or Angela or Freddie or any of us would say, oh, no, women's rights to safe spaces have to be undermined. Women's rights to be in a women's refuge have to be undermined.
But do they compete?
The big issue for me...
Do they compete?
No, I don't think they compete. But what I think is that they must be allowed to be alongside each other. So, in other words, safe spaces for women have to be preserved.
But Angela,
and
do you agree with that?
In the Equality Act.
Yeah.
But can I just introduce another thing, which is children, which is, as you know, Jo, my big passion is the rights of children. And I do think the lack of clarity, and it is the vitriol in the public discourse, is actually confusing for many, many children. And actually, I do feel that proper education and information is absolutely vital. And I do take the point what Freddie says, that sometimes if you are questioning as a very young person, you might be encouraged to go in a different direction.
Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
John Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with his friend, the Tees Valley Mayor, that the National Audit Office must investigate the Tees Works affair? And will he share details of all conversations he has had on the subject with his former Chief Secretary, the member for Middlesbrough South, and the current Levelling Up Minister, given that they've all received donations from Ian Waller, one of the project backers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, Honourable friend, the Levelling Up Secretary, has already announced an investigation into this matter. But what I would say, it's just the same old. It's the same old bump from Labour. All we get, after years of neglect, it's the Conservatives that are delivering for Teesside.
Mr. Speaker, everyone here has NHS trusts in our constituencies grappling with backlogs. So can I highlight the commitment and hard work of the Gloucestershire Hospitals Trust in bringing down the waiting list over 18 months ahead of the government deadline and fast reducing the over 65 waiting list? Does my right honourable friend agree with me that those who imagine that the opposition has a magic wand up their sleeve to solve these problems need look no further than the woes of the Betsy Cadwallader board in North Wales, under Labour political control for a generation?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend says, Gloucestershire in particular has seen a significant reduction in A&E waiting times since December. We recognise, of course, though, there is more to be done, and that's why we're delivering on our plan to recover urgent and emergency care, to ensure that people get the care they need easier, faster and closer to home.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
How many work visas were issued to foreign nationals last year?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the new statistics, as the honourable gentleman knows, will be out later this week. The most recent statistics we have, as the ONS said at the time, contained a set of unique circumstances, including welcoming many people here for humanitarian reasons.
The figures are out. It's 250,000 work visas were issued last year. He knows that answer. He just doesn't want to give it. And the new numbers tomorrow are expected to be even higher. The Prime Minister stood on 3 Tory manifestos. Each one promised to reduce immigration. Each promise broken. They all stood on those manifestos as well. Why does he think his Home Secretary...
Order. I'm going to hear this question. Those who don't want to hear it, we know the answer. Keir Starmer.
They all stood on those manifestos. So why does he think his Home Secretary seems to have such a problem coping with points-based systems?
Mr. Speaker.
And the same respect will be shown, Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, just this week we announced the biggest ever single measure to tackle legal migration, removing the right for international students to bring dependents, toughening the rules on post-study work and reviewing maintenance requirements. But what is the honourable gentleman's contribution? There are absolutely no ideas. There is absolutely no ideas, absolutely no semblance that there would be any control. Why? Because he believes in an open-door migration policy.
Mr. Speaker, if anyone wants to see what uncontrolled immigration looks like, all they've got to do is wake up tomorrow morning, listen to the headlines and see what this government...
Order. Mr. Bristow, I think you're going to be leaving. I'm asking you to leave now, because otherwise I'll name you. I'm not having it, and I've warned you before. It's the same people. And the same will happen on this side. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the reason they're issuing so many visas is labour and skills shortages. And the reasons there are shortages is the low-wage Tory economy. Under his government's rules, businesses in IT, engineering, healthcare, architecture, welding can pay foreign workers 20% less than British workers for years and years on end. Does he think his policy is encouraging businesses to train people here or hire from abroad?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about immigration, but we know his position because it turns out that Labour would actually like to see even more people coming to the UK, increasing the numbers. That's not just my view, Mr. Speaker. Those were the words of his own frontbencher who said having a target isn't sensible and that the numbers might have to go up, Mr. Speaker. So it's clear, whilst we're getting on with clamping down on legal migration, listening to the British public, he's perfectly comfortable wanting to say that he wants free movement back.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, they've lost control of the economy, they've lost control of public services, and now they've lost control of immigration. And if he was serious about weaning his government off the immigration lever, he would get serious about wages in Britain and get serious about skills and training. The apprenticeship levy isn't working. It's hard to find a single business that thinks that it is. And the proof is that almost half the levy isn't even being spent. That's fewer young people getting the opportunities they need to fulfil their potential. Businesses are crying out for more flexibility in the levy so they can train up their staff. Labour would give them that. Why won't he?
Mr. Speaker, it's right that we're talking about education and skills. What he failed to mention is just in the past week, what did we discover? Thanks to the reforms of the Conservative government, our young people are now the best readers in the Western world, Mr. Speaker. Reforms that were opposed by the party opposite. He also talked about our record on the economy. And I am very surprised, Mr. Speaker, because I've stood here week after week when he's been so keen to quote the IMF, Mr. Speaker. And he seemed to have missed their press conference yesterday, where they actually raised our growth forecast by one of the highest they've ever done, said that we've acted decisively to make sure that the economy is growing, and credited this government with having a very positive effect on future growth.
Is the Prime Minister seriously suggesting that breaking the economy, breaking public services, losing control of immigration is some sort of carefully crafted plan? His policies are holding working people back, and all he offers is more of the same. But fear not, because speeding into the void left by the Prime Minister comes the Home Secretary. Not with a plan for skills, growth or wages, no. Her big idea is for British workers to become fruit pickers. Just in case, I can hardly believe she said this, that they forget how to do things. Does the Prime Minister support this let them pick fruit ambition for Britain? Or does he wish he had the strength to give her a career change of her own?
Mr. Speaker, he talks about public service, he talks about the economy. Again, I think he's just failed to notice what's going on. The IMF, as they've said, it's right here, Mr. Speaker. our forecasts, which he was very keen to point out just a few months ago, now their forecasts are that we will have stronger growth than Germany, France and Italy, Mr. Speaker. What do they say? They're saying that we are prioritising what's right for the British people, Mr. Speaker. He talked about public services. I said, best reading results in the Western world when it comes to the NHS. What did we just discover last week? Ambulance waiting times at the fastest response in 2 years, Mr. Speaker. That's a Conservative government delivering for the British people.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary may need a speed awareness course. He needs a reality check. This mess on immigration reveals a Tory party with no ambition for working people and no ambition for Britain. Just the same old failed ideas, low wages and high tax. Labour would fix the apprenticeship levy, fill the skills gap and stop businesses from recruiting from abroad if they don't pay properly. That's because we're the party of working people. What does it say about him and his party that they won't do the same?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think he said it 6 times, but I don't think we actually know how he's going to do any of these things, Mr. Speaker. And look, that's the difference between us, Mr. Speaker, because every week we hear a lot of empty rhetoric from the honourable gentleman opposite. But in the past week, we can measure ourselves by actions. What have we done on this side of the House? We've introduced new powers to curb disruptive protests. We're protecting public services against undisruptive strike action, Mr. Speaker, and we have new laws to stop the boats. What has he done? He's voted against every single one of those. And that's the difference between us. While he's working on the politics, we're working for the British people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have all witnessed how Putin is carrying out his savage war against Ukraine. He commenced it, he is the aggressor, and he cannot be allowed to win. That war is now at a pivotal point. So will the Prime Minister use his friendship with President Zelensky to ensure whatever military equipment they need, they will get, be that missiles, drones or jets?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was an honour to welcome my friend President Zelensky to the UK last week. I think everyone will be collectively proud of the UK's leading role at the forefront of supporting Ukraine. We were the first country to provide support for Ukrainian troops, first country to provide lethal weapons in Europe, the first to commit main battle tanks, and most recently the first to provide long-range weapons. He will have seen the powerful scenes coming out of the G7 summit in Hiroshima last week, and I've always been clear that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we learned today that the price of milk, cheese and eggs are up 29%. The price of pasta is up 27%. The price of a loaf of bread, 18%. Does the Prime Minister agree that this is no longer just a cost of living crisis? This is a cost of greed crisis.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was welcome that inflation has fallen today, but as the Chancellor said, we should not be complacent because there is more work to do. The Honourable Gentleman's right to highlight the impact of food inflation, which is too high, common here in levels that we've seen in other European countries like Sweden and Germany. We are providing significant support to help people with the cost of living, and the Chancellor has met with companies in the supermarket and food supply chain to make sure that they are doing everything they can to bring prices down.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, let's get real, because the food inflation remains at a near 45-year high. Now, yesterday the Treasury indicated that the Chancellor stands ready to act, but his actions seem to be predicated on the outcome of a review by the Consumer and Market Authority. So can the Prime Minister perhaps enlighten us? When does he expect that review to conclude? Because working families can't afford to wait much longer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, honourable gentlemen will know that the CMA is independent of government, but the Chancellor did meet with them recently to discuss the situation in the grocery industry, and it will be for the CMA to make decisions on that. But we're doing everything we can to help consumers manage the challenges of the cost of living, Mr. Speaker. But if the SNP wanted to do their bit, maybe that they could reconsider their deposit return scheme, which has been, it's very clear what people have said. As people have said, it will reduce choice and increase prices for consumers.
Andrew Samuel.
The Primary Care Access Plan published this month is a very welcome and substantive one, and my constituents want to see rapid delivery of it. So how quickly will the government start providing the £645 million to pharmacists, and how quickly will the SAS doctors come to GP surgeries to make prompt access to primary care a reality for my constituents?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his contributions to our primary care plan. He and I both know that pharmacies already work to help many people with their health needs, and to help deliver on our priority to cut NHS waiting lists. They will be put front and centre of our primary care recovery with £645 million of additional funding. That will be released later this year as pharmacies start to provide more oral contraception, more blood pressure checks, and crucially, for 7 common ailments like ear infections or throat infections, pharmacists will now be able to provide you with the medicines that you need.
Alder Mees.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1/4 of the population of Northern Ireland are on a health waiting list. Our workers are on strike for fair pay, and our public finances are in a mess. Will he give a commitment that the Treasury will immediately begin work on a public sector rescue package so we can transform the health service and ensure that our public sector workers are given a decent wage? And will he join with the people of Northern Ireland, Mr. Speaker, in telling the DUP to get back to work now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've been clear, I firmly believe that Northern Ireland is governed best when governed locally, and I agree wholeheartedly with him that the major challenges he raises can only be properly addressed by the restoration of the institutions. But I also understand the immediate and pressing concerns he raises, and that's why we've prioritised health in the Northern Ireland budget for this year with £20 million of more funding. And I know my honourable friend will be an important contributor to the conversations that the Secretary of State is having to embark on public service reform and restore the executive.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, I raised the issue of AI with the Prime Minister. Only since then, we've seen announcements from firms such as BT that tens of thousands of jobs are likely to be lost to this new technology. But many will be created too. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we need to map the jobs and the regions that will be most affected by artificial intelligence so that we can target the skills to prepare Britons for the jobs of the future best?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and like him, I believe that AI does have the potential to transform our economy and society, but of course it has to be introduced safely and securely. We are investing more in AI skills, not only in top-tier talent, but also enabling those from non-STEM backgrounds to access the opportunities of AI. I look forward to getting more recommendations from him for how we can strengthen our investment in skills to make sure everyone can realise the benefits that this may bring.
Anna McMorran.
Thank you. While the Prime Minister upgrades his local energy grid to heat his 40-foot swimming pool, hands oil and gas companies the likes of BP and Shell £11.4 billion in tax breaks, he scraps the energy price guarantee scheme, plunging record numbers of people into poverty. Is it just a coincidence that these same energy giants funded the Prime Minister's leadership campaign, or is he simply out of touch?
Mr. Speaker, what we are doing is taxing the windfall profits of energy companies and using that money to help pay around half of a typical household's energy bill. That support is worth £1,500. It was extended in the budget by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, and we all look forward to energy bills coming down, which hopefully will be happening very soon.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He will recall the commitment he gave to the Building a Brighter Future plan for major investment at Torbay Hospital back in January. Does this commitment remain unchanged?
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend on his continued campaign to improve Torbay Hospital. I'm delighted to reconfirm the government's commitment to major new facilities there as part of our new hospitals programme, and I look forward to further work progressing in the months ahead.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Under the Conservatives, so much of the UK's potential is going untapped. Anemic growth, falling living standards and declining international competitiveness. Just this morning, a solar power company developing an innovation from Oxford University said that the UK is the least attractive market in which to base its business due to a lack of incentives. This is a homegrown company that could have provided well-paid green jobs lost to this country thanks to the government's lack of an industrial strategy. So why does the Prime Minister think it is that each week more and more promising businesses are choosing to leave the UK?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady obviously missed the comments from the IMF yesterday, upgrading our growth performance. She obviously missed the survey of thousands of global CEOs just recently placing the UK as their #1 European investment destination. And it sounds like she also missed my trip to Japan last week, where we announced £18 billion of new investment into the UK economy.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liberal Democrat-run South Cambridgeshire District Council is the first in the country to put its staff on a 4-day week without any reduction in pay. It's led to a reduction in services and an increase in costs. And yet last week, the Liberal Democrats decided to increase the trial to a year. Why? Because the staff were happier. And now unions are pushing to spread the 4-day working week across the public sector, something that the Taxpayers Alliance estimates will cost £30 billion. Does my right honourable friend agree with the Prime Minister, agree with me, that the public sector are here to serve the public and that the Liberal Democrats aren't working?
Mr. Speaker, public servants should rightly focus on delivering for the public and taxpayers, and it is disappointing to hear from my honourable friend that his local Liberal Democrat council is not doing this, reducing, as I heard, staff contact hours and costing residents more. I urge the council to reconsider their decision because his residents and constituents in South Cambridgeshire District Council clearly deserve better.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Lewisham, we are gearing up to mark the 75th anniversary of HMT Empire Windrush arriving in the UK. And our Deputy Mayor, Brenda Dacres, is coordinating our local events and is herself a daughter of Windrush generation parents. Now, sadly, at the same time, she is organising advice surgeries for families who have been denied their rights and are still waiting for support from the Windrush compensation scheme 4 years after it opened. So with this landmark anniversary coming next month, will the Prime Minister commit to ensure everyone finally gets the compensation they deserve?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady's constituent for all the work they're doing locally. The Home Office and the Government is delivering on the vast majority of the recommendations from Wendy Williams' report into this situation, and we've already paid out or offered, I believe, over £70 million in compensation, and there are hundreds of engagement events happening to ensure that people are aware of what they're able to access, and will continue to do that engagement as we promised.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bassett Law has benefited from the multi-billion-pound STEP Fusion project, 20 million in levelling up money for Worksop Town Centre, and will now be part of one of the 20 areas selected as part of a new £400 million levelling up partnership. But my constituents in Retford feel neglected by the Labour District Council, which has yet to apply for any funds for the town and is more concerned with trying to play the two towns off against each other. Could the Prime Minister confirm that there is no reason whatsoever why Retford cannot benefit from this latest investment, and would he accept an invitation to visit Bassett Law to see the great impact government investment is already having in the area?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his kind invitation to visit, and I shall certainly ask my office to keep it in mind. But as he said, levelling up partnerships are a commitment to work hand in hand with 20 different places across England, most in need of levelling up, and to make sure that they can realise their potential and ambitions. As he says, they're backed by £400 million of investment. We'll make sure that they can be supported to thrive. And I know my right honourable friend, the Levelling Up Secretary, is looking forward to working with colleagues in Bassett Law to identify the best place to focus their work, which could, of course, include Retford.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2016, the Prime Minister told people to vote for Brexit because it would stop unelected officials in Brussels having more of a say than his constituents. In 2023, he's asking his MPs to block Amendment 42 to the EU law bill to give unelected officials in Downing Street more say over laws than this chamber. Given the worries and the warnings from his colleagues, why is he going to let the blob have more say over things like holiday entitlements than the people who were elected to do so?
Mr. Speaker, that's just simply not the case. It's the elective government that will be making decisions about what the right regulations are for our country. And it's absolutely right that as a result of Brexit, we can now do that, which is why we are repealing and reforming over 2,000 pieces of retained EU law, making sure that our statute book reflects the type of rules and regulations that are right for the British economy and will deliver growth and cut costs for consumers. And that's what our reforms do.
Robin Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A key issue which has haunted Keighley for many decades is child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs. I want to see a full Rotherham-style review into child sexual exploitation across my area, but yet Bradford Council's leader and our West Yorkshire Mayor both refuse to back one, due to political correctness getting in the way, simply sweeping this issue under the carpet. So will the Prime Minister, for the sake of victims, work with me to ensure that our local leaders do the morally right thing and instigate a full Rotherham-style inquiry across the Bradford district?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for campaigning on this? As I've said before, we shouldn't let political correctness stand in the way of keeping vulnerable girls safe or indeed holding people to account. As he knows, it's for authorities in the local area to commission local inquiries, and I have no doubt that he will continue to encourage them to do so. For the government's part, we've commissioned the relevant inspectorate to examine current policing practice in response to group-based sexual exploitation of children, and the Home Office will not hesitate to act on its recommendations when they are published this summer.
Andy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I was elected, I worked for a number of years in learning and development in both the police and the private sector, and I'm sure we can all agree that training is absolutely vital to encourage innovation, creativity, but also for compliance. Given that seems to be a particular issue for the Prime Minister's Cabinet at present, will he agree to support my ministerial training standards bill that I'll be presenting later today?
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable lady knows, there are processes and procedures in place for ensuring professional standards across government. With regard to training, what I am pleased we're doing is rolling out the lifelong learning entitlement, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that people at any stage in their career can get access to years of government subsidised financing, to ensure that we have a workforce that's fit to the future and everyone can realise the opportunities that are there.
Steve Bryan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Owen Carey died just across the river from here, underneath the London Eye, after suffering a severe allergic reaction while out celebrating his 18th birthday. He'd simply eaten a chicken burger at a restaurant, which, unbeknown to him, and despite his asking, had been marinated in buttermilk. Owen's sister Emma, who is my constituent, was in Parliament last week with her dad and her brother for a debate on food labelling and support for people with allergies. They're fighting for Owen's Law, which is campaigning, among other things, to change the food information regulations surrounding allergy labelling in restaurants. It's attracted huge support. So will the Prime Minister meet with me and Owen's family to see how we can be sure something positive comes out of this tragic loss of a young life?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising Owen's case, and I know the whole House will want to join me in expressing our condolences to Emma and all of his family over what happened. I will absolutely ensure that my honourable friend gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss food labelling appropriately so that we can make sure that things like this don't happen.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister instruct his officials to publish the list of 1,700 veterinary medicines that will no longer be made available to Northern Ireland vets and the agri-food sector? after the grace period has ended. And will explain to the Ulster Farmers Union why that list has not been given to them, and would he agree to meet with me and the Ulster Farmers Union, go through that list and show us how this has removed the border in the Irish Sea?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman knows, when we concluded the Windsor framework, what we did was make sure that there was an extension in the grace period for veterinary medicines to give us the time to find a long-run solution to that particular issue. But the honourable gentleman should take heart, because on the issue of human medicines, which I know is important to him and everyone else in Northern Ireland, what we did achieve was complete and full dual regulation of medicines and a dialogue with the EU to resolve the issues in veterinary medicines. And I know that he will want to make sure that we engage closely with him and the UFU, which we have been doing, to find a resolution in the time we have. But I know he will also join me in being very happy that we protected access to human medicines in Northern Ireland, which was a priority for him and his party.
John Hunt.
Firstly, I really look forward to welcoming the Prime Minister to Portman Road for Ipswich Town, Southampton next season. And of course, in addition to Ipswich Town, Ipswich Wanderers have also been promoted. Great news for a town. Yesterday, though, we saw, despite the Public Order Act being passed, we saw images of Metropolitan Police standing around and doing nothing, whilst eco-protesters were wreaking havoc in our capital. Does the Prime Minister agree with us? The moment those activists stand on the road, they should be immediately turfed off the road, like there are in many other countries.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on honourable friends, first observation, all I can say is ouch, but thank you. But I look forward to the game. But on his second, more substantive matter, this government has passed the serious disruption order, which will ensure that police do have the powers that they need to tackle slow-moving protests. It was a power that the police specifically asked the government for. We've delivered it and put it in legislation. He knows what I know, is that the party opposite tried to block that from happening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, we have 4 million children living in poverty in this country, yet we are the 5th richest economy in the world. So can the Prime Minister say why he would not support universal free school meals for all children to end child poverty?
Mr. Speaker, the numbers are actually as follows. Since 2010, there are 1.7 million fewer people living in poverty as a result of the actions of this government, and that includes hundreds of thousands fewer children living in poverty. And most importantly, because like the Honourable Lady, I do want to ensure that children don't grow up in poverty, but we know that the best way to do that is to ensure that they don't grow up in a workless household. And that's why we have reduced the number of children growing up in a workless household by several thousand, and that is the most powerful thing we can do in the long run to give those children the best possible start in life.
Peter Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, Nancy Spencer from Darlington has raised over £35,000 for St Teresa's Hospice in the last 25 years. Nancy's next adventure was to do a skydive, but having had a pacemaker fitted, her doctor refused to sign it off. However, undeterred, my 80-year-old constituent managed to secure sign-off for a wing walk. Will my right honourable friend join me in wishing Nancy well as she takes to the skies this Saturday?
Well, can I join my honourable friend in thanking Nancy for all her fantastic fundraising work, and of course wish her the best of luck for Saturday. I do wonder if my honourable friend will be joining her, and in particular, many of my own constituents use St Teresa's Hospice over the years, so I know what fabulous work it does. But more generally, the hospice sector supports more than 300,000 people with life-limiting conditions in the UK every year, and I pay tribute to all the staff and volunteers working in palliative and end-of-life care for the incredible work they do.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree that it's completely inappropriate for schools to encourage young people under the age of 18 to socially transition, for example by changing their names and their pronouns? All this is going on without parental consent or even knowledge, in breach of parents' human rights. Will the Prime Minister instruct the Department of Education to order schools to stop indoctrinating our children and to concentrate on their duty of care to protect them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've been very clear that when it comes to matters of sexual education and PHSC, it is absolutely right that schools are sensitive in how they teach those matters and that they should be done in an age-appropriate fashion. The Department for Education is currently reviewing the statutory guidance and curriculum that goes to schools so we can tackle this particular issue, because there have been cases raised with the government and others where this has not been the case. I don't think that's acceptable. We must protect our children, and that's what our new guidance will do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the independent members of the Betsy Cadwallader Health Board in North Wales became so concerned about the board's finances that they arranged for Ernst & Young to produce a forensic accountancy report which revealed serious misconduct on the part of several senior board executives, including a conspiracy to falsify accounts. Astonishingly, the response of the Labour Welsh Health Secretary to this scandal was to demand the resignation of those independent board members, while almost all the senior executives in question have been allowed to remain in post, many of them drawing six-figure salaries. Does the Prime Minister agree that this disgraceful state of affairs should be investigated by the police, and does he further agree that it demonstrates why Labour are unfit to run important public services in any part of our country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as my right honourable friend knows, I am deeply worried about the Betsy Cadwallader Hospital in Labour-run North Wales. It has been, as he said, in special measures for 6 of the last 8 years, and as he remarked, the official audit said there was worrying dysfunctionality. I do hope this issue is investigated properly, and I believe my honourable friend is in contact with the Secretary of State for Wales to take this further.
Mr. Speaker, working people are barred from receiving legal aid if they earn £12,750 a year. So why is the Prime Minister forcing the British public to foot the bill, which I think is currently £250,000 plus, for the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Rushtrip's alleged lying inquiry? Why can't he stand up for the British people? Is it because he's too weak?
Mr. Speaker, it's actually a long-established process across multiple administrations that former ministers are supported with legal representation after they have left office to deal with matters that relate to their time in office. That has been the practice for many years, as I said, across multiple political administrations, both Labour and Conservative.
No question, Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's ongoing engagement to ensure that mental health is treated as equally as physical health. And of course, in my own constituency of Watford, Watford General Hospital, we recently received about £350,000 for improvements to mental health facilities, which will help massively. But given the importance of this issue, would the Prime Minister join me in encouraging fellow colleagues from across the House to attend an event I'll be hosting for the Baton of Hope on the Terrace Pavilion at PMQ, after PMQs today, to raise awareness around mental health and suicide prevention? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a fantastic campaigner on mental health, and I'm pleased to learn about all the work he is doing with the Baton of Hope. I'm pleased that we're also putting more government money into mental health services and taking more action on this issue than any previous government, investing an extra £2.3 billion a year, and I would encourage all colleagues to join him in attending the reception on the Terrace Pavilion.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
And as the Speaker of the House just said, that does bring us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's Questions. Let me introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, we have the Transport Minister, Richard Holden. For Labour, the Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, and the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent, Nick Eardley, is here too. Well, there was a bit of drama right at the beginning. We hadn't long got into Prime Minister's Questions when the Speaker, clearly very irritated by the Conservative MP Paul Bristow, told him to leave. And that was the beginning of exchanges between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, in which Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, one way or another, seemed to be the sort of core issue. Because just before Prime Minister's Questions started, we discussed the fact that the Prime Minister is not going to instruct an investigation into how she handled a speeding offence, but the conversation was all about net migration. Why is that important?
Really interesting. She was sat beside the Prime Minister as well. That was a very
choreography is always important.
Absolutely. A public vote of confidence there. Whilst a lot of Westminster is obsessed with her keeping her job and not facing this investigation, the other big problem the government's going to have this week is tomorrow when we get the net migration figures. And what Keir Starmer was clearly trying to do is get on the front foot with that and lay out a bit of what he hopes Labour can say before the next general election. There was some policy in there, snuck in there. I'm not sure it was flagged up all that much.
But we're going to.
Checking with Labour afterwards, and that was Keir Starmer saying that the skills shortage list allows foreign workers to be paid 20% less than domestic workers. Labour are saying they'd scrap that because they think it provides an incentive to bring in cheaper foreign labour. Also changes to the apprenticeship levy too. But fundamentally, that was a bit of a battle over whether the government was doing enough on immigration, and actually, given how little policy we've had from Labour about exactly what they would do to bring it down, how they'd achieve something different.
One of the policies that has been announced by the government is, and that was yesterday, Richard, a curbs on foreign students bringing over dependents, because we're expecting the figures, the net migration figures, to hit a record high of around 700,000 tomorrow when they're published. Apart from the announcement on student numbers, why is it so high?
I think the student numbers one is particularly interesting because it's been a huge increase. I think it's 8-fold increase in the last few years of people bringing dependents with them. So this is clearly being used as in some quarters as a route to try and bypass the normal migration system which we have.
A route that you created and promoted, in fact.
Well, absolutely, and this was we've always welcomed foreign students here. Right. I think there's a difference between foreign students coming to study and one where they're bringing, large numbers of their family with them as well.
But you promoted that too. I mean, it wasn't just that you were promoting coming to Britain to do a master's, you were also promoting it on the basis that people could bring their families to.
Well, I think it was, we wanted...
I've seen adverts.
We wanted a sensible system where people could come... Now we're restricting that to PhD students who have got long-term study and will be contributing, hopefully, to research in the UK. I think that's a sensible move from the government.
Well, as I say, and that's been underlined by Emily Thornberry, it was something you created and also promoted. There is also the other issue, as Nick Eardley was talking about, and that is work visas for people coming to fill shortage occupations. Yesterday, we spoke to Madeleine Sumption from the Migration Observatory, who said the key point is who can get a skilled worker visa. What types of workers do we not need? I mean, which group would you get rid of on that list?
Well, I think the key thing on all this is it's going to reflect the individual circumstances every year,
right?
And that's what that's why we have the list, which can change over time.
Well, it hasn't changed. It's increased. You've extended the groups of people, maybe rightly, but you've made it easier for some people to come here. That was announced at the budget. Bricklayers, roofers, plasterers, carpenters, tilers. They've all been added to the list. So when Rishi Sunak says, I want to get the overall number down when it comes to immigration, again, rightly or wrongly, how are you going to do it?
Well, I think there's one thing is allowing skilled workers into the UK and seasonal workers as well, which we've also got an ability to do. I think it's quite different when you're seeing either the families of people who are students coming into the UK. I think it's right to restrict that. I mean, that's clearly a sensible thing to do. And I think it's quite a difference from the open door policy that we had under the previous Labour government.
Right, OK. I mean, who would you remove from that list? And we'll come to the open door policy, which is what Rishi Sunak said, that's what Labour and Keir Starmer would do if you win the next election. But which groups or categories would you remove from that shortage occupation list?
So let me start with just slamming the lie. So it is our policy to have a points-based system, but to have one that works. The one that we have at the moment actually entrenches the problems that we have. So there's nothing within the points-based system at the moment that feeds into. So a lot of there are.
Do we need these groups of people?
So there are some professions that have been on the list for 15 years. You know, we haven't had enough engineers. You know, so what we need to do is we need to have a link between the list and ensuring that we prioritise the training up of people into the skills
and in the
of those
meantime,
areas.
we'll need more people in those groups.
But we need to have a policy which focuses on making sure that we train up British people to fill the.
But that's
we
sort of
don't have that.
No, all right, but that is a longer-term ambition.
They've been in power for 13 years, and what would have been good is if they had done that. But since they haven't done that, that is what we will do. Okay, so I think that's kind of an important thing. And there are 250,000 work visas that are issued each year. And if we can train people into the areas where we don't have enough workers, then obviously that will help to deal with that issue, and also will give people good quality jobs. And the other announcement, which was really important today, is that we're not going to allow employers to employ people from abroad at 80% of the wage that people would get, a British person would get. It's not fair. It results in undercutting, and it results in tensions that are unnecessary.
Will the numbers overall come down?
Well, given that this is what our plan is, it's likely to come down, because if we're training people up, because we need to link up, apprentices, and we need to link up skills training with the list of professions that we don't have enough people in.
Okay.
So we also, so for example, on the apprentice levy, what we've also said is that only half of the apprentice levy is actually used because it's so restrictive. So we would change that so that more people could use the apprentice levy and get trained up.
Okay, and these are the policies that you have just said that you would.
Immigration,
but as you
go absolutely hand
perhaps
in hand.
honestly say, it would be likely to reduce the overall number. I mean, the Conservatives have made much over various Conservative governments about bringing down the numbers. In fact, originally,
every one of their manifestos.
Well, let's have a listen to David Cameron talking about it.
If we take the steps set out today, if we deal with all the different avenues of migration, legal and illegal, then levels of immigration can return to where they were in the 1980s and 1990s, when immigration was not a front-rank political issue. And I believe that will mean net migration to this country will be in the order of tens of thousands each year, not the hundreds of thousands every year that we've seen over the last decade.
I mean, that was 2011, Richard Holden. David Cameron talking about reducing net migration to below 100,000. You've never got even close to it. And now, in fact, it's at its highest level ever. And yet still, we have the Home Secretary, for example, being probably the most recent person in government to say, no, it's still our ambition to reduce it somewhere in the region of 100,000. Which is rubbish, isn't it?
Well, I think you can see from the actions taken in the last couple of days that we're clearly taking on these sort of family visa route.
13 years. 13 years. You've just done something in the last couple of days.
I would also just point out that one of the things that we've done in the last few months is really push through some pretty important legislation to really restrict the amount of illegal migration.
Oh, no, but hang on. Let's stick with legal. No, let's stick with legal migration. We talk a lot about illegal migration, but the real figures, and I'm only saying that they're high because that's what politicians keep telling me, that they want to bring it down, both on the Conservative and on the Labour side. It's 13 years of failure to hit that target, pledge, promise to bring down overall levels of immigration.
No, you're absolutely right, and which is why we have to take more action, which is what we're doing literally in the last few days with trying to tackle the student element issue. But I think
so I think what they try to do is they talk about the small boats issue, and they make a big noise about that, and that's proportionately a very small number, and they hope whilst
illegally crossing the channel,
and 700,000 legal.
Yeah, but actually, Emily, let's focus on the legal migration, because one of the interesting points is that when the UK was still part of the EU, there was freedom of movement, and the figures are actually higher now in terms of migration. So why has Keir Starmer changed his mind on free movement? Why not still support that idea of free movement with the EU? The figures were lower then.
Because we've left the European Union and we've left the single market and we've left the customs union. So what we want to do is we want to have immigration that supports our economy and the needs of our economy, and depending on the needs of the economy will depend on how many people we get coming into the country.
But he did defend it, Keir Starmer, as one of his 10 pledges in the leadership campaign, defend free movement as we leave the EU.
Yes, but since he became leader, we've left the EU. And we've left the EU on the agreement that we've made. And what we want to have is a points-based system that works properly and doesn't entrench the problems that we have within our economy as the current points-based system does.
But he has
we need to have a points-based system.
Well, the government does have a point. But the government does have a points-based system.
But it needs to be linked with the way in which we train people up on skills. We have to, as we make more announcements, and we will, on how we train people up, on what our skills agenda is, it will become clear that the areas where we don't have enough people, in particular professions, we will be able to fill because we're going to train them up.
In terms of this issue for both parties, interestingly, Labour MP Diane Abbott said there's very little difference between the Conservatives and Labour to pick when it comes to policies on net migration. Do you think that's how voters will view it when it comes to the next election on this issue?
I suppose the crux of it is both leaderships are saying we want to get it down, but we also want to meet the needs of the economy, which isn't a firm commitment to getting it down necessarily. Because
that's why skill is absolutely at the centre of it.
Sure, but are you going to go into the election saying to people we will bring net migration down, or are you going to say we will bring it down if it's good for the economy?
We will skill up people so that the areas where we don't have enough people... And it is an answer. It's absolutely the answer. Where there are vacancies and where we don't have enough people, we will be training people up to fill those vacancies so that we will not need to bring people in from abroad. And we certainly won't be bringing them in cheap.
If Labour win power next year, by the time you leave office, will net migration have gone down?
By the time, sorry, if we win the next election...
By the end of that
well, yes. I mean, I can see no reason why not, because if we're in power for 5 years and we're able to train people up... Look, we've already said what we would do in relation to the NHS. We've said how we will pay for it. We will double the number of nurses. We will double the number of doctors. It'll take 7 years to train up a doctor, I appreciate, but it'll be less time to train up a nurse. We've said how we will pay for it. That, for example, will be a big hole in our... if you look at where the skills holds are. These are some, and we've already announced that, and there will be more to come.
All right, well, let's put the same to Richard.
Now and the next general
put the same question to Richard. Will you go into the next election promising, again, to bring down net migration?
I just want to reflect on something Emily's just been talking about. We're seeing another volte-face today from the Labour leader, like a total U-turn on the previous policy that they've basically been pursuing, which was basically on open borders with the European Union. And today they're now trying to pivot in a totally different way to a policy he wasn't selected on, which wasn't what Labour have been pursuing for years. And now they're trying to pretend that they want to get control of immigration when every single thing that we've done to try and clamp down on illegal migration particularly, they've voted against. It just seems to me that they are all over the place when it comes to immigration, whether it's legal or illegal immigration. And as for the sort of policy around wanting to change the levy, I'm all in favour of tweaks to that. I was a special advisor in the Department of Education when we were looking at this. It's not true to say that the money isn't spent.
Half of it is not spent.
No, that's that's literally not true. Actually, that money goes back to the Treasury to support small businesses to train people.
So it's not spent on, but it's not spent on apprenticeships.
No, it is. No, Emily, no, it is spent on apprenticeships. It's just spent on apprenticeships by small businesses rather than by the large employers. I understand why Emily wants to change that system, because back in the day, you could get level 1 apprenticeships at Tesco doing shelf stacking. We changed that to really upskill what apprentices are absolutely about, put some real rigour back into the system, just like we've done with our policy around reading. Now, 4th in the world, way above where we were before. So actually, when it comes to...
It's so rigorous that half of it is not used.
Hang on. Finish your point, because I want Emily to respond to your accusation.
It is used. It's just used by small employers through the apprenticeship levy, which is what it's there for. It's not there to allow employers to do shelf stacking courses. No. It's there to have proper apprenticeships for people right across the country. It's spelled by small employers in my constituency, and I think it's a vitally important thing that.
And you'll go into the next election promising lower overall immigration.
I think we've constantly trying to do that. We can see what we can. You can judge us by our actions.
The opposite's happening.
Judge us by our actions when we're clamping down on the boats,
you by your actions.
And we're clamping down on these student visa routes as well.
Right. Well,
Richard, you went into the last general election standing on a manifesto saying you would get net migration down below 250,000. It's now 3 times that.
And you can see
that's a failure.
And you can. I agree. And you can see exactly what we're trying to do there. We're trying to target these student family routes. We're trying to clamping down on the boats in the Channel. These are important things we've got to do. Every single step of the way, we've been opposed by the Labour Party. And every single time we've tried to do anything to control immigration.
Right. Can I just be clear on this? You agree that your party has been a failure when it comes to the...
We are clearly not in the place we would like to be in, which is why the Prime Minister yesterday is taking decisive action to close down some of these degrees, routes through the student route for those on bachelor's degrees and master's degrees being able to bring over the family.
All right,
it's why we're also taking action on illegal migration as well. And every single time we try and do any of this, we're opposed by the Labour Party. I don't even know if Labour support what we're trying to do on stopping students bringing over family at the moment.
I think they do, was the announcement by Labour yesterday. Emily, is that right? Are you backing the Kurds? What I also
but I mean, it is absolutely, it's a classic magician's trick. You strangle the bunny with one hand whilst you're doing God knows what with the other. And that's what they
I'm trying not to do that
talking
today.
about illegal migration and small boats and everything else, and that is tens of thousands, whilst 700,000 people seems to be the number of legal migration, and they have no policy.
You said on the manifesto in the last election of having open borders.
Up to 700
control numbers totally.
I mean, that's true, isn't it, Emily?
I'm sorry. I get shouted over.
The Labour pledge was to stand on freedom of movement from the EU, and even as the UK leaving the EU, it was still to have free movement.
So when we were in the European Union, we had freedom of movement.
Even as we were leaving, Keir Starmer reiterated that pledge.
And the deal that was done with the European Union was done nearly a year after Keir became leader. And the deal that Boris Johnson did on Christmas Eve was the deal that he did. And so we have now left, and so our policy now, given this is where we are outside the single market, we are outside the customs union, is that we want to do with migration, is we want to have a migration system that actually supports. We have policies in relation to that. We have a government that will talk about illegal migration and tens of thousands in small boats, but will not talk about any kind of sensible policy when it comes to legal migration and making sure that we have a migration system that supports the economy.
Let's talk about, because we haven't got long, actually, let's talk about business and who is the party of business. Rachel Reeves, Nick, the Shadow Chancellor, has been, or is still, I think, in the United States, schmoozing business leaders over there. It's been sort of coined as the shrimp cocktail offensive 2.0, referring obviously back to the prawn cocktail offensive in the Blair-Brown era. What are the reports so far?
Well, look, I mean, Rachel Reeves has made a very big thing about trying to woo business, and taking that transatlantic is all part of the pitch. I suppose the big question that Labour is going to face over all of this is what concrete things it's going to do to change the relationship with business. I think it's fair to say that business was a bit more comfortable under the current government than it perhaps has in the past. And I just suppose, again, a question for Emily is what's Labour going to do differently?
Yeah. So I think when you say the business is more comfortable with the current government, you mean the fag end of the Tory government, as opposed to in the sort of more red meat days.
Well, don't put words into...
So, I mean, obviously there is the business have a lot of criticisms, for example, of the deal that was done with the European Union. But one of the things that
which you're going to open and renegotiate,
which needs to be renegotiated after 5 years anyway. That's built into the agreement. But we think that there are all kinds of holes in it. I mean, as I say, it was agreed on Christmas Eve. You know, you can just imagine there are all kinds of holes in it, and we need to make sure that those holes are plugged, because there are important sectors of the economy.
What else are you going to do to be a friend of business?
The other thing that we're going to do is, and that's kind of, this is the most important one, is that we're going to be a party of growth. We need to grow our economy, and we have a policy for that.
Well, it's growing. It's growing, according to the forecast of the International Monetary Fund.
Is to invest £28 billion a year in transforming our economy into a green economy. So that is making our own energy. That is building factories that can build the batteries that are necessary for the car industry. That is ensuring that we insulate our homes.
All right.
That is doubling the amount of onshore wind, doubling the amount of offshore wind, changing our planning system. I mean, there is a lot, you know, and we will continue to produce the policies between now and the general election. But I tell you, when it comes to being policy rich, we will be. And business recognises that.
Well, Richard,
and you can see that by the difference of actually that business has towards us.
Well, let Richard respond.
Excited by our agenda.
Well, of course, and you would say that. I mean, Richard, is there a problem? Is there a sort of legacy of the Boris Johnson famously saying F business, or certainly big business, that is now hanging over even the current administration?
I think what you've seen with our really big push on capital investment, particularly with the way that we've structured the corporation tax system to drive long-term investment, I think that's exactly the right thing to do. I think business are really welcoming that. You can see that with £18 billion agreement just this week when the Prime Minister was at the G7 in Japan. That's investment coming to the UK. I've already seen some of that investment not far away from my own constituency with the new Nissan battery plant going in for all those new electric cars in Sunderland. Well, I mean...
The only one. There'll be 30 in Europe and one in Britain.
100 million.
And that will be the end of our
let him finish.
100 million, it certainly won't be. In fact, all the scare stories which Emily and her colleagues like to put around before we left the European Union have turned out not to be true in that regard. And I just think, Emily talks about holes. I mean, there's massive holes whenever we look at the Labour Party. You can't trust Keir Starmer because he said one thing when he was backing Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. He said another thing during the leadership election. What business needs is to be able to trust the leaders of our country and provide certainty there over what they're actually going to do. What Keir Starmer does is change his mind every time he's got a new audience.
Can I just, before we go, before the end of the programme, Suella Braverman, we started this part of Politics Live saying that there isn't going to be an investigation into how she handled speeding fine. There's been an exchange of letters. Why not, Richard? Why hasn't the Prime Minister decided to look into what was a potential breach of the Ministerial Code?
My understanding is he spoke to the independent overseer of this and they said that it wasn't necessary in this instance. So that's...
I mean, the accusation has been that he's too weak to actually...
let's just unpick what happened here. Suella Braverman was caught speeding, took the fine and the points. That's what's happened. She asked if there would be if she could do a course instead. She decided just to take the points and pay the fine.
Well, that's not the whole story.
Well, that's literally it. And so I don't know what more investigation you want. I mean, we all know that Emily was speeding not that long ago on her way to Labour conference. I don't know what the consequences of that were.
He's too weak to get rid of her. And as was said at the weekend, he had to kind of work out what to do. Could he sack her or not? And if she was sacked, she would machine gun him from the backbenches.
And that's all we have time for, I'm afraid, on that note. Bye-bye.